This is being presented as the final key for one reason only: there is nothing beyond it to seek. Not because it explains God better, but because it dissolves the position of the one who was trying to understand God in the first place. That is why it can only appear when it does. And that is why you didn't find it by chance. For most of your life, the idea of God likely existed as something slightly out of reach. Something to believe in, question, move toward, or reject. Different names, different systems, different explanations, all pointing upward, outward, or beyond. Yet none of them fully settled the question. Not because they were wrong, but because they were incomplete. They addressed the concept of God without addressing the position of the one doing the seeking. The final key does not arrive as an answer to a theological question. It arrives as a correction of orientation. It reveals that the problem was never lack of information, but misidentification. God was framed as something to be understood, while the nature of the one trying to understand was left unquestioned. That oversight is what kept the search alive. You didn't encounter this moment randomly because random encounters don't resolve lifelong questions. Recognition does. And recognition only occurs when consciousness reaches a level of coherence where it can see itself without distortion. That coherence is not earned through effort or belief. It forms naturally through lived contrast, failed frameworks, and the quiet exhaustion of chasing explanations that never quite land. If you're here now, it's because that exhaustion has done its work. The need to argue, defend, or adopt a position has softened. In its place is a readiness to see something simple, not dramatic. Something precise, not grand. The kind of simplicity that only appears after complexity has been fully explored. The final key is not a teaching about God. It is the moment when the distance between you and what you've been calling God collapses. Not emotionally. Structurally. It reveals that the separation was never real, only assumed. And once that assumption loosens, understanding stops being something you pursue and becomes something that recognizes itself. This is why this moment matters. Not because it gives you a new belief, but because it quietly ends the search. Not by force. By clarity. If this recognition has already begun to land, like the video now as a confirmation. There has always been a quiet tension moving through you. Not loud enough to be called conflict, not sharp enough to be called doubt, but persistent. A sense that the explanations never fully covered what you were actually perceiving. On one side, science spoke with precision, logic, and proof, yet something essential felt missing. On the other, spirituality spoke of meaning, unity, and transcendence, yet often asked you to suspend discernment. You were never confused by this tension. You were attentive to it. Most people resolve that discomfort by choosing a side. They commit to belief and dismiss inquiry, or commit to analysis and dismiss mystery. But you didn't do that. Not because you were indecisive, but because something in you refused incomplete maps. You could feel that both sides were pointing towards something real, and that neither was wrong, just unfinished. That persistent question never left you because it wasn't meant to. It wasn't a problem to solve, it was a signal. A signal that the model of reality being offered to you was incomplete. Doubt, in this sense, was not resistance. It was intelligence refusing to settle too early. It was awareness sensing that the frame itself needed to expand. You may have noticed that the questions evolved over time. Early on, they sounded like curiosity. Later, they felt heavier, more existential. Eventually, they became almost silent, not because they disappeared, but because they moved beneath language. When questions sink that deep, they are no longer looking for answers. They are preparing the ground for recognition. This is where many misunderstand what doubt actually is. Doubt is only confusion when it circles without depth. When it deepens, it becomes refinement. It strips away borrowed certainty, second-hand explanations, and inherited assumptions. What remains is a clean, open space where something true can finally land without being distorted to fit an old framework. You were never meant to resolve the tension by choosing science over spirituality or spirituality over science. The tension existed because both were incomplete when held separately. Your awareness could feel that separation itself was the flaw. Not a flaw in either domain, but in the way reality had been divided. That is why the question stayed with you even when you tried to ignore it. Even when life was busy. Even when answers seemed good enough. It resurfaced in moments of stillness, awe, contradiction, and clarity. It followed you not as an obsession, but as a quiet companion. Patient. Unresolved. Waiting. Preparation does not look like effort. It looks like endurance. The endurance to live with unanswered questions without forcing resolution. The endurance to let frameworks collapse when they no longer fit. The endurance to remain open without becoming ungrounded. This is not confusion. This is maturity. The fact that you are here now means that preparation has reached completion. The question has done its work. It has softened the rigid edges of belief and the rigid edges of skepticism alike. It has created space. And space is the only requirement for recognition. If you feel that something you carried for a long time is finally being met rather than answered, comment with the words, "I am ready," to anchor this recognition. This is the final key because it does something no other explanation has done before. It doesn't give you a better idea about God, reality, or consciousness. It removes the position that required ideas in the first place. And once that position dissolves, seeking ends naturally, without effort, without discipline, without conclusion. Most systems fail not because they lack insight, but because they speak only to the mind. They offer concepts, models, metaphors, and frameworks. Useful, sometimes profound, but still external to the one receiving them. As long as understanding remains conceptual, there is always distance. Someone understands something. Someone learns about something. And where there is distance, there will always be more to seek. This key operates at a different level. It does not add knowledge. It aligns identity. And identity alignment changes everything because reality responds to what you are being, not to what you are thinking about. When identity is misaligned, even the most accurate information becomes another object to chase. When identity aligns, understanding stops being something you accumulate and becomes something you inhabit. This is why no further framework is needed after this. Frameworks exist to orient someone who believes they are outside of what they are trying to understand. Once that assumption dissolves, the framework collapses with it. Not because it was wrong, but because it has completed its function. The search for God has always assumed separation. Even reverent separation. Even mystical separation. Something divine over there, something human over here. Something to reach, interpret, embody, or return to. The final key reveals that this orientation was the only thing keeping the search alive. Not ignorance. Not sin. Not lack of effort. Orientation. When orientation shifts, effort becomes unnecessary. Questions quiet down not because they were answered one by one, but because the structure that generated them is no longer in place. This is why recognition feels final without feeling rigid. There is no sense of arrival, no sense of achievement. Just a calm absence of tension where seeking used to live. Identity alignment is subtle. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up as ease. As a lack of urgency. As clarity without excitement. As certainty without argument. When this alignment occurs, reality stops feeling like something you need to figure out or improve. It begins to feel responsive, intimate, and self-consistent. This is also why the final key cannot be upgraded, refined, or replaced. Any addition would reintroduce distance. Any improvement would imply deficiency. Any next step would assume you are not already where you are. The key is final because it removes the need for keys altogether. Nothing is being taken from you here. No belief is being attacked. No tradition is being invalidated. What dissolves is the assumption that you are separate from what you've been trying to understand. And once that assumption loosens, everything else reorganizes naturally. This recognition does not make you special. It makes seeking unnecessary. It doesn't elevate you above others. It places you back into coherence with what has always been true. That coherence is not dramatic. It is stabilizing. The final key ends the search not by answering every question, but by revealing why the search was happening at all. And once that is seen clearly, there is nowhere else to go. Not because you are finished, but because you are finally aligned. At a certain point, the image of God that once provided comfort begins to feel strained. Not wrong, not offensive, just insufficient. What once worked no longer fits the way awareness now perceives reality. This is not a failure of faith. It is the natural collapse of a model that has completed its purpose. Belief is not a mistake. It is a developmental stage. It serves consciousness when direct perception is not yet available. Belief gives structure where recognition has not yet stabilized. It provides orientation when identity still feels small, separate, and uncertain. In that stage, an external God makes sense. Something greater, watching, guiding, intervening. Something to appeal to, obey, or aspire toward. But belief always contains distance. Even the most reverent belief assumes separation. Someone believes in something. Someone relates to something outside themselves. As consciousness matures, that distance becomes uncomfortable. Not emotionally, but structurally. The old image no longer aligns with lived experience. Questions arise that belief cannot answer without stretching itself into contradiction. This is where many people stop. They either cling harder to belief or reject it entirely. Both reactions miss what is actually happening. What is happening is not loss. It is transition. Belief is giving way to recognition in the same way imagination gives way to perception. Not because imagination was false, but because it is no longer needed. Recognition does not oppose belief. It replaces it by rendering it unnecessary. You don't stop believing because you decide to. You stop believing when belief becomes redundant. When what belief was pointing toward is now being perceived directly. The external God model collapses not because God disappears, but because distance does. The moment consciousness begins to recognize itself more clearly, the need for an external reference point dissolves. God no longer functions as an object of belief. God becomes the field of awareness itself, no longer conceptual, no longer imagined. This shift can feel destabilizing if it is misunderstood. It can feel like something sacred is being taken away. In reality, something artificial is falling off. What remains is quieter, but more intimate. Less dramatic, but more precise. Recognition does not shout. It does not demand allegiance. It simply reveals what has always been present once the scaffolding is removed. Belief asked you to trust something you could not verify. Recognition requires no trust at all. It is self-evident. It does not rely on authority, tradition, or interpretation. It stands on direct clarity. And once that clarity appears, belief has nothing left to do. This is why the shift feels irreversible. You cannot return to belief once recognition has stabilized, not because belief was wrong, but because it no longer fits your orientation. Just as you cannot unsee something once it has been clearly seen. The collapse of the external God model is not the loss of God. It is the end of projection. It is consciousness withdrawing an image it no longer needs and stepping into direct intimacy with what that image was pointing toward all along. Nothing sacred is lost in this shift. What is lost is distance. What is gained is immediacy. And immediacy does not require belief. It requires only the willingness to see what is already here. Separation feels real because it is experienced consistently, not because it is fundamental. It feels like the most obvious thing in the world. You hear, reality out there, God somewhere beyond both. This perception shapes almost everything: how you relate, how you pray, how you try, how you doubt. Yet what feels obvious is not always what is true. Often it is simply what has gone unquestioned long enough to appear solid. Separation did not arise because something fractured in reality. It arose because identity localized. Awareness focused through form and began mistaking the lens for the whole. The moment consciousness identified exclusively with a body, a name, a history, a role, a boundary appeared. Not in reality itself, but in perception. That boundary created an inside and an outside, a self and an other, a human and a God. From that single perceptual split, fear was born. Fear of not being enough. Fear of disconnection. Fear of abandonment. Fear of judgment. And alongside fear came unworthiness, the quiet assumption that whatever is divine, whole, or complete must exist elsewhere. Somewhere you are not. Somewhere you must reach. This is why separation has always carried emotional weight. It was never a neutral idea. It shaped how you related to everything. Life became something to survive, improve, or earn your place within. God became something to appease, impress, or return to. None of this came from truth. It came from misidentification. God was never elsewhere. That idea only made sense as long as awareness believed it was confined to a fragment. The moment that belief loosens, the entire structure built on it begins to dissolve. Not violently. Quietly. Like tension releasing from a muscle that has been clenched for too long. Separation is not dissolved by affirmations or effort. It dissolves when it is seen clearly for what it is, a perceptual habit, not a cosmic fact. The illusion was not that unity had to be achieved. The illusion was that it had ever been lost. This recognition does not make the world disappear or individuality vanish. Forms remain. Differences remain. Experience continues. What disappears is the sense of exile. The feeling that you are cut off from source, meaning, or intelligence. What returns is intimacy with existence itself. When separation dissolves, unworthiness cannot survive. There is no external standard to fail against. No distant authority withholding approval. No gap to bridge. What remains is coherence. A quiet knowing that you are not outside of what you are seeking because there was never an outside to begin with. This is not a comforting belief meant to soften fear. It is a structural correction. And structural corrections change how reality is experienced at every level. Effort relaxes. Resistance softens. Control loosens. Not because you are giving up, but because there is nothing to push against anymore. If you are aligned with this frequency, subscribe and remain within it. For most of human history, God was imagined as a figure because consciousness needed form to relate to what it could not yet perceive directly. A figure has edges. A face. A will. A location. These qualities made the divine approachable to an awareness that still experienced itself as separate and limited. The image was never the truth. It was an interface. Anthropomorphic models were not primitive errors. They were transitional structures. They allowed relationship where recognition was not yet available. They gave meaning to awe, fear, gratitude, and surrender at a stage when consciousness could not yet hold abstraction without dissociating. In that context, God as a figure was necessary. But figures always exist somewhere. They occupy space. They act from a point. And anything that exists somewhere can be imagined as absent elsewhere. This is where limitation quietly entered the picture. God became a being among beings, even if the greatest one. Creation became something separate from Creator. And consciousness learned to look outward for what was never external. As perception refines, this model begins to strain. Not because it is false, but because it is too small. Awareness starts to sense that what it is calling God cannot be contained in a personality, a location, or a narrative. The divine begins to feel less like someone watching reality and more like what reality is made of. This is where the shift occurs from figure to field. A field has no edges, no center, no preference. It does not act from one point to another. It is the medium within which all points arise. When God is recognized as field rather than figure, divinity is no longer something that intervenes in reality. It is the structure through which reality exists at all. This reframing changes everything without adding complexity. God is no longer an external authority making decisions about the world. God is the intelligence inherent in existence itself. Not thinking about reality, but expressing as it. Not responding to events, but giving rise to them. The earlier models were necessary because consciousness needed relationship before it could tolerate intimacy. A figure can be related to from a distance. A field cannot. A field includes you. It has no outside. And that inclusion can only be perceived once identity is stable enough to dissolve separation without fear. Outgrowing the figure does not mean rejecting reverence. It deepens it. Reverence no longer flows upward towards something distant. It becomes horizontal and immediate. It appears as respect for existence itself. For life. For awareness. For the intelligence moving through every form. When God is understood as field, prayer changes. Not because it becomes less sincere, but because it becomes less performative. There is no one to impress. No one to convince. There is only attunement. Alignment. Recognition. This shift does not remove mystery. It removes projection. What remains is something quieter and far more vast. Not a deity watching from beyond the world, but the world itself as an expression of something infinite, intelligent, and present. God as figure was a doorway. God as field is what the doorway opens into. To understand how reality actually operates, one assumption has to be gently but completely reversed. The assumption that consciousness exists inside reality, inside the body, inside the brain. That assumption feels natural because it has been repeated for generations. But what feels natural is not always what is accurate. When this assumption is examined closely, it collapses under its own weight. Consciousness is not something happening within reality. Consciousness is what reality is happening within. Everything you experience, thought, sensation, memory, perception, appears inside awareness. Not one of these things exists outside of it. You never encounter reality directly, you encounter experience. And experience is inseparable from the awareness that knows it. This is not philosophy. It is direct observation. Reality's mechanics are simple once this inversion is seen. There is no objective world over there being passively observed by a separate subject in here. Observation is not a secondary act applied to reality. Observation is part of reality's structure. The observer and the observed arise together, as one unified process. When consciousness is assumed to be a product of matter, everything becomes distorted. Awareness is treated as an accidental byproduct of complexity. Meaning becomes optional. Intelligence becomes localized. And the universe is reduced to a collection of unconscious objects somehow producing experience. This model never fully worked, even scientifically. It only persisted because no alternative was taken seriously. When consciousness is recognized as fundamental, the picture reorganizes instantly. Reality is no longer something that exists first and is later perceived. Reality and perception arise together. There is no gap between them. The moment something appears, it appears within awareness. And without awareness, nothing can be said to appear at all. This is why the observer cannot be removed from the equation. Not because observation interferes mechanically, but because observation is the condition for appearance itself. To observe is not to stand outside reality. To observe is to be the process through which reality takes shape. The observer and the observed are not two things interacting. They are one event, one movement, one field expressing itself as knowing and known simultaneously. Separation only appears when identity claims one side of that process and forgets the other. This recognition changes how existence is felt. You are no longer a point inside a vast universe trying to understand it from within. You are the field of awareness in which the universe is appearing. Not metaphorically. Structurally. Every sensation, every sound, every thought confirms this if you look closely enough. Nothing needs to be believed here. You do not need to adopt a new philosophy. You only need to notice where experience is actually occurring. Not conceptually, but directly. Awareness is always present before anything else. It does not come and go. It does not move. It does not react. It is the constant within which all change happens. Once this is seen, the question of where consciousness is located dissolves. It is not located anywhere. Location itself appears within it. Space, time, form, and matter arise as expressions inside awareness, not containers of it. This is the foundation. Everything that follows rests on this inversion. Consciousness is not in reality. Reality is in consciousness. And the moment this is recognized, the structure of existence becomes far simpler than it ever appeared before. Creation has been misunderstood for so long because it was framed as an act of force. As if reality needed to be pushed, persuaded, or overridden. As if something had to be made to happen against resistance. That misunderstanding came from assuming separation, a separate self trying to manipulate a separate world. Once that assumption loosens, creation reveals itself as something far simpler and far more precise. Observation is not passive. But it is also not aggressive. It does not impose. It allows. And allowing is not doing nothing. Allowing is the absence of distortion. When awareness is coherent, reality organizes itself naturally without interference. This is not mystical language. It is structural. Force always implies fear. Fear that what is wanted will not arrive unless it is controlled. Fear that reality left alone will choose wrongly. Control is the attempt to collapse outcomes prematurely, based on limited perception. It narrows possibility. It compresses the field. And it often produces resistance because reality does not respond well to distortion. Recognition works differently. Recognition does not demand. It notices. And what is noticed clearly stabilizes. When awareness recognizes something without grasping, without pushing, without needing it to be different, coherence forms. That coherence is what reality responds to. Creation, then, is not about effort. It is about alignment. Not alignment with desire, but alignment with truth. When perception is accurate, action becomes unnecessary. Reality reorganizes itself around clarity in the same way a body naturally balances when tension releases. This is why allowing is so powerful. Allowing removes the noise that was interfering with the signal. It lets the field resolve itself without being constrained by fear-based observation. The moment you stop trying to control how something must unfold, the range of possible outcomes expands. Observation is creation because what you consistently recognize as real becomes stabilized in experience. Not because awareness commands reality, but because awareness is the medium through which reality takes form. When awareness is fragmented, reality appears fragmented. When awareness is coherent, reality responds with coherence. This is also why forcing never produces lasting change. You can push circumstances temporarily, but the underlying pattern remains unchanged. Recognition, on the other hand, alters the pattern itself. It changes the level at which reality is being experienced, not just the surface conditions. Coherent awareness is calm. Not indifferent, but steady. It does not need to monitor outcomes constantly. It does not oscillate between hope and fear. That steadiness is not emotional suppression. It is alignment. And alignment creates without strain. Nothing here requires belief. You have already experienced this in moments where things resolved themselves effortlessly once you stopped interfering. Moments where clarity replaced urgency. Moments where the solution appeared when the need to force disappeared. Those were not coincidences. They were demonstrations of how creation actually works. Reality does not respond to intensity. It responds to coherence. It does not respond to control. It responds to clarity. And clarity is not something you manufacture. It is what remains when resistance drops. Observation is creation not because you are powerful, but because separation was never real. When awareness recognizes itself clearly, reality simply follows suit. Everything you have ever tried to change, understand, or resolve has only ever appeared in one place. Not in the past. Not in the future. Only here. Only now. This is not a poetic statement. It is a structural one. There is no other access point available to consciousness. The idea that time causes things is one of the most persistent misunderstandings in how reality is navigated. Time feels like a force because experience is remembered and anticipated. But memory and anticipation are appearances happening now. The past does not exist anywhere except as a thought arising in the present. The future does not exist anywhere except as a projection arising in the present. There is no other place they occur. Creation does not move through time toward you. Creation happens as the present moment takes form. Recognition does not unfold gradually across a timeline. Recognition happens instantly, or not at all. When clarity appears, it appears now. When coherence stabilizes, it stabilizes now. There is no delayed access. Time is not causal. It is navigational. It helps the mind organize experience, sequence events, and coordinate action. But it does not create reality. Reality is always being formed in the immediacy of awareness. The moment awareness shifts, experience shifts. Not later. Immediately. This is why waiting has never produced the transformation you were seeking. Waiting assumes something real will arrive from the future to complete the present. That assumption subtly reinforces lack. It positions fulfillment as something ahead of you rather than something available through recognition now. The future becomes a container for resolution, and the present becomes something to endure. The present moment is not a slice of time between past and future. It is the only place awareness actually exists. Everything else is conceptual overlay. When attention leaves the present, it does not go anywhere real. It moves into thought. And thought cannot create. Thought can imagine, remember, analyze, and plan, but creation requires presence. Recognition only occurs now because recognition requires awareness to be aware of itself. And awareness can only notice itself in immediacy. You cannot recognize truth tomorrow. You cannot recognize it yesterday. You either see it now, or it remains unseen. This is why forcing timelines fails. Forcing assumes movement through time is required for change. Allowing recognizes that change happens when perception aligns. When alignment happens, the present reorganizes itself. Circumstances shift not because time passed, but because resistance dropped. You have experienced this every time something resolved the moment you stopped struggling with it. Not after weeks of effort. Not after perfect conditions. But in the instant clarity replaced urgency. That instant was the present moment doing what it always does when interference ends. The present is not small. It contains everything. It is where memory appears, where anticipation appears, where sensation appears, where meaning appears. It is the only interface consciousness has with reality. And because of that, it is the only place creation can occur. Nothing needs to be rushed. Nothing needs to be postponed. The moment is not waiting for you to arrive in it. You are already here. And when recognition stabilizes here, there is nowhere else reality needs to go. Identity is the mechanism through which reality is selected. Not effort. not intention. Not willpower. What you experience is not the result of what you try to make happen, but the result of what you are being when you stop trying. This is where most misunderstanding begins, because effort feels active while identity feels invisible. A timeline is not something you move toward. It is something you resonate with. Reality does not respond to pursuit. It responds to coherence. When identity stabilizes at a certain frequency, the version of reality that matches that frequency becomes visible, accessible, and inevitable. No chasing required. Effort assumes distance. It assumes you are here and what you want is over there, separated by time, obstacles, or inadequacy. That assumption quietly reinforces misalignment. You can work very hard from the wrong identity and produce very little change. You can do very little from the right identity and watch everything reorganize. This is why forcing outcomes rarely works the way it is imagined. Forcing is the behavior of an identity that does not trust reality to respond unless it is pressured. That lack of trust introduces tension. Tension distorts perception. Distorted perception collapses limited outcomes. The result feels like resistance, delay, or failure, but the real issue was never effort itself. It was the state effort was coming from. Timelines are not rewards for hard work. They are mirrors of alignment. When you shift who you are being, what you experience shifts automatically. Not later. Not eventually. Automatically. Because reality is not responding to your actions in isolation. It is responding to the signal your identity is broadcasting continuously. This is why you have seen situations change the moment you stop trying to change them. Not because you gave up, but because the identity that was pushing dissolved. When that identity relaxed, a different signal was broadcast. Reality responded instantly, not out of favor, but out of resonance. Identity is not something you construct. It is something you recognize. It is revealed when effort drops and awareness becomes honest. Who are you being when no one is watching? Who are you being when nothing is at stake? Who are you being when you are not trying to get anywhere? That is the identity reality is responding to. Timelines are not linear paths you travel. They are states you occupy. You do not arrive at a timeline through struggle. You find yourself in one through alignment. This is why striving often keeps you circling the same patterns. The identity remains unchanged, so the reflection does too. When identity shifts, reality does not need time to catch up. Time was never the mechanism. Recognition was. The moment alignment stabilizes, the corresponding version of reality becomes available. Circumstances reorganize. Opportunities appear. Resistance dissolves. Not because you earned it, but because you matched it. You do not select timelines by effort because effort is something you do. Timelines respond to who you are being. And who you are being becomes clear the moment you stop trying to become something else. Emotion has been treated as a problem for so long that its true function has been overlooked. It has been managed, suppressed, reframed, or spiritualized away, as if feeling were an obstacle on the path to clarity. In reality, emotion is not noise in the system. It is the system's feedback. Every emotional state carries information. Not about what you should do, but about where you are aligned. Emotion is the immediate response of consciousness to its current orientation. When awareness is aligned with its true nature, emotion expands. When awareness is misaligned, emotion contracts. This is not punishment or reward. It is guidance. Expansion feels like ease, clarity, openness, relief, resonance. Contraction feels like tension, anxiety, frustration, heaviness, urgency. These sensations are not random. They are not personality traits. They are signals indicating whether your current perspective is coherent with reality or resisting it. Most suffering comes from misunderstanding this signal. Instead of listening to emotion, it is argued with. Instead of being read, it is judged. Instead of being used as information, it is treated as something to fix. This creates a secondary layer of resistance that intensifies the original contraction. Emotion is not asking to be eliminated. It is asking to be interpreted correctly. When you feel contraction, it does not mean something is wrong with you. It means the perspective you are holding is out of alignment with what is true. Often that perspective involves control, fear, comparison, or the belief that something essential is missing. The emotion arises not to punish that belief, but to signal it. When you feel expansion, it does not mean you have arrived at a final state. It means your current orientation is accurate. You are seeing clearly. You are allowing rather than forcing. You are aligned rather than resisting. Expansion is confirmation, not completion. Emotion is frequency-based guidance because reality responds to coherence, not morality. There is no emotional hierarchy imposed from outside. There is only feedback. Just as a body uses sensation to maintain balance, consciousness uses emotion to maintain alignment. This is why chasing positive emotion fails. Positive emotion is not a goal. It is a byproduct of alignment. When you try to force yourself into a better feeling state without addressing the underlying misalignment, emotion becomes distorted. It may be temporarily masked, but the signal does not disappear. It returns until it is acknowledged. Listening to emotion does not mean indulging it. It means respecting its message. The question is not, how do I get rid of this feeling? The question is, what assumption am I holding that this feeling is responding to? That single shift restores emotional intelligence. As alignment increases, emotional swings become smaller and clearer. You stop fearing contraction because you recognize it as guidance. You stop clinging to expansion because you recognize it as confirmation. Emotion becomes neutral information rather than a personal story. This is how emotion stops controlling you and starts guiding you. Not by suppression. Not by analysis. By recognition. Emotion has always been the instruction. You were never meant to overcome it. You were meant to listen. At the deepest level, nothing changes until something is recognized. Not forced. Not fixed. Not improved. Recognized. Every other mechanism you've explored, emotion, identity, presence, alignment, was never an action in itself. Each one was simply pointing toward this single principle. Effort operates from the assumption that something is missing. That assumption creates movement, tension, and striving. Recognition operates from clarity. And clarity does not move. It settles. The moment something is seen accurately, it no longer requires management. It reorganizes naturally. This is why effort has always felt exhausting, even when it was successful. Effort requires constant maintenance. Recognition does not. Once something is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. And what cannot be unseen no longer demands energy to uphold. Reality adjusts around it automatically. Recognition is not passive. It is precise. It cuts directly through distortion without engaging it. When you recognize that a belief is misaligned, the belief loosens without argument. When you recognize that a desire is fear-based, the urgency dissolves without suppression. When you recognize that separation was assumed, not real, the struggle collapses without resistance. Every time you tried to change yourself, what you were really trying to do was arrive at a state you believed would finally feel right. Recognition bypasses that entire process. It reveals why the state was never missing to begin with. The moment that is seen, the need to change disappears, and with it, the friction that made change feel necessary. This is why recognition stabilizes alignment while effort destabilizes it. Effort pulls attention into the future, into improvement, into becoming. Recognition anchors awareness in truth now. And alignment only exists now. You cannot align later. You can only recognize now. Nothing responds to effort the way it responds to clarity. Reality does not rearrange itself because you want it to. It rearranges itself because distortion has been removed. When perception becomes accurate, behavior adjusts. Circumstances follow. Not as reward, not as punishment, but as reflection. Recognition also explains why techniques stop working over time. Techniques rely on repetition. Recognition relies on insight. Once insight occurs, repetition is no longer required. Trying to apply effort after recognition is like continuing to push a door that has already opened. The push adds nothing. It only reintroduces strain. This is the difference between doing and seeing. Doing implies time, progress, and accumulation. Seeing is immediate. Seeing does not ask how long it will take. Seeing ends the question. You have already experienced this. Every genuine shift in your life occurred in a moment of clarity, not in a moment of struggle. The struggle may have preceded it, but it never caused it. The cause was always recognition. Recognition is the only action because it is not an action at all. It is the absence of misperception. And when misperception falls away, alignment does not need to be maintained. It becomes the default. Nothing else is required. No method needs to be perfected. No identity needs to be constructed. What shifts reality is not what you do next, but what you finally see clearly now. You were never meant to escape your humanity to realize truth. Embodiment was never a mistake to transcend. It was the vehicle through which recognition could occur. This is where the final misunderstanding dissolves, the belief that individuality implies separation, that being a form means being cut off from the whole. Individuality is not fragmentation. It is localization. A lens does not divide light from itself. It focuses it. In the same way, what you call a self is not a broken piece of something larger. It is a focused point through which the whole experiences itself with precision. Nothing was ever lost in that focusing. Nothing was removed. The feeling of being a fragment came from mistaking the lens for the source. When awareness identified exclusively with the form, the sense of limitation followed naturally. The body appeared small. The mind appeared bounded. Life appeared external. And from that misidentification, the story of separation was born. But separation was never an actual condition. It was a perceptual error. A confusion of scale. The ocean does not become less ocean because it forms a wave. The wave does not need to reconnect to the ocean. It has never left it. Its movement, shape, and lifespan do not define its substance. You are not an isolated point inside reality. You are reality taking a point of view. This is why embodiment is not opposed to unity. It is its expression. The whole does not lose itself by appearing as many. It knows itself through that appearing. Each perspective adds richness, contrast, depth. Without lenses, there is no seeing. Without form, there is no experience. When the final sense of fragmentation dissolves, nothing about your life needs to change. You still think. You still feel. You still act. But the weight drops. The quiet assumption of exile disappears. You are no longer living as someone trying to return to something you left. You are living as what has always been here, now aware of itself. This recognition does not erase individuality. It frees it. You no longer have to protect it, improve it, or justify it. It is no longer a defense against the world. It becomes a contribution to it. A unique angle through which intelligence expresses itself naturally. There is deep relief here. Not relief from responsibility, but relief from distortion. You stop carrying the burden of being incomplete. You stop interpreting difference as distance. You stop measuring yourself against an imagined whole you thought you were separate from. Nothing needs to merge. Nothing needs to dissolve. The only thing that ends is the belief that you were ever a fragment looking for wholeness. You were always a lens of the whole, never outside it, never separate from it, never broken off. The moment this is seen clearly, embodiment stops feeling like limitation and starts feeling like participation. Not a part trying to become whole. The whole, seeing itself from here. When recognition stabilizes, seeking ends without ceremony. Not because curiosity dies, but because the tension that drove the search dissolves. There is no longer a sense of lack pushing you forward, no invisible finish line you are trying to cross. What remains is movement without urgency. Interest without hunger. Engagement without pressure. Living without seeking does not mean life becomes static or passive. It becomes responsive. Instead of asking what you should become, you begin noticing what is naturally unfolding through you. Instead of scanning the horizon for meaning, meaning reveals itself in what is already happening. Not imposed. Not assigned. Discovered through participation. Seeking was always fueled by the belief that something essential was missing. That belief organized your choices, your striving, your self-improvement, even your spirituality. Once that belief dissolves, effort relaxes. You still act, create, choose, and explore, but the energy behind those actions changes. They are no longer attempts to complete yourself. They are expressions of what is already complete. This is where life begins to feel coherent. Not perfect. Not effortless in a superficial sense. But internally consistent. Actions align with insight. Choices feel clean. You stop second-guessing your own movement because it no longer comes from fear of being wrong or behind. You are no longer trying to arrive somewhere else to finally be at peace. Existence becomes exploratory rather than corrective. You are not fixing yourself. You are discovering how the whole expresses itself through this particular configuration. Curiosity replaces striving. Creativity replaces ambition. Presence replaces projection. Without seeking, comparison loses its grip. There is no longer a hierarchy of paths or timelines you feel pressured to match. What others are doing becomes interesting rather than threatening. Inspiration replaces competition. You can appreciate difference without interpreting it as distance or deficiency. This is also where simplicity emerges. Not minimalism as a rule, but clarity as a natural state. You stop adding layers to compensate for imagined lack. You stop chasing experiences to confirm worth. You stop overthinking decisions that once felt heavy. Life does not shrink. It clarifies. Living without seeking does not remove challenges. It removes the story that challenges are evidence of failure. Difficulty is no longer interpreted as misalignment or punishment. It becomes information. Feedback. A moment asking for adjustment rather than self-judgment. There is a quiet confidence that settles in. Not the confidence of knowing outcomes, but the confidence of knowing you are not separate from whatever unfolds. You no longer need guarantees to move forward. You trust coherence because you are no longer fighting it. Time feels different here. Not rushed. Not stalled. Spacious. You are no longer living for a future version of yourself that is finally allowed to relax. Relaxation happens now, and from that relaxation, movement continues naturally. Living without seeking is not an ending. It is the end of a misunderstanding. What begins is a way of living where existence is no longer something to conquer or decode, but something to participate in fully, openly, and honestly. You are not trying to get life right anymore. You are letting life express itself through you. What is happening here does not end with you. It never could. Recognition is not a private possession. It is not an achievement held by an individual. It is the field becoming aware of itself through a specific point of view, and that awareness does not stop at the edges of a body or a personal story. There is only one field. And every time it recognizes itself anywhere, that recognition is immediately available everywhere. Not through communication, not through teaching, but through coherence. When one point of the field stabilizes in clarity, the entire field subtly reorganizes around that clarity. This is not metaphor. It is structure. You are not awakening in isolation. You never were. The sense of individuality made it feel that way, but individuality was only the lens, not the boundary. What you are realizing now is the same realization emerging across the field through countless perspectives, at different speeds, through different languages, in different forms. The timing varies. The recognition does not. This is why your clarity matters without making you special. The field does not favor certain lenses over others. But every lens that clears contributes to the overall coherence of the system. When distortion drops in one place, the signal becomes easier to detect elsewhere. Recognition ripples. Collective awakening does not happen through agreement or ideology. It happens through stabilization. Through individuals no longer reinforcing separation through fear, force, or misidentification. Every time you live from recognition rather than reaction, you reduce noise in the field. Every time you respond from clarity rather than contraction, coherence increases. This is not a responsibility to carry. It is a natural consequence. You are not being asked to save, convince, or awaken anyone. Being is enough. The field does not need effort. It needs availability. Humanity's deepest struggles were never caused by lack of intelligence or resources. They emerged from separation consciousness mistaking itself for reality. Competition, domination, scarcity, and fear are reflections of that misperception. As recognition spreads, not through persuasion but through presence, those patterns lose their foundation. You do not need to announce this understanding. You do not need to defend it. You do not need to make it into an identity. In fact, the more quietly it is lived, the more powerfully it transmits. The field recognizes itself most clearly when it is not being performed. What you are participating in now is not the end of a journey, but the stabilization of a truth that has always been present. The arc completes not with a conclusion, but with a return. A return to simplicity. To coherence. To unity experienced without effort. The field is not awakening somewhere else. It is awakening here. Through you. Through others. Through countless forms simultaneously. Not as an event, but as a remembering. This recognition does not belong to you. You belong to it. Subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it.